We all think we know exactly what discrimination looks like, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah. We picture the obvious stuff.
Right, like a hiring manager tossing a resume in the trash just because of a name, or, I don't know, someone shouting a slur on a sidewalk,
Mm,
or a bank manager who actively decides they just hate a certain group of people.
exactly. We view it as this malicious, very conscious choice.
But, okay, picture a 100-meter dash, right? And one runner is placed like 20 meters behind the starting line,
Yeah.
and their specific lane is just completely covered in hurdles.
Right.
The referee who's standing at the finish line with the stopwatch, I mean, they aren't biased, they aren't hateful, they are literally just clicking a button when someone crosses the line.
Doing their job.
Exactly. But the terrifying reality that we are unpacking today is that the most powerful forms of discrimination, they don't actually happen at the finish line. They're baked into the construction of the track itself.
Which is exactly why we are pulling apart the deeply embedded sociological realities of prejudice, racism, and discrimination today.
Yeah, we have a lot to get through.
We really do. We are exploring a highly curated collection of work. It's titled The Social Fabric Unraveled, created and produced by Adam Crenshaw.
A really amazing deep dive we've got set up for you today.
Totally. And the sources laid out for this deep dive, they range from foundational sociology textbooks detailing the tools of dominance to a highly localized 2007 sociological study of Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
We've also got some really intense stuff from Michigan, right?
We do. We are analyzing historical and contemporary accounts of Arab Americans in Dearborn, Michigan, alongside some very raw, like highly politically charged YouTube transcripts that document community conflicts there.
Which we definitely need to talk about.
And just to tie it all into the modern economy, we're examining financial data on that workplace phenomenon everyone's talking about, the Nepo baby.
Yes, the Nepo baby.
Yeah.
But before we take it a single step forward, we really need to address the elephant in the room regarding those Dearborn YouTube transcripts you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because we are dealing with raw, highly charged material here concerning the Muslim community and local residents, and you, listening right now, you need to know our approach here is strictly analytical.
Completely neutral.
Right. We are not taking political sides. We are absolutely not endorsing, validating, or, condemning the viewpoints, the religious arguments, or the claims made by the creators of those videos.
We are just looking at them as artifacts.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on this raw source material solely to use it as a real-time sociological case study. We're treating these videos as tools to help us understand group dynamics, stereotypes, and, well, ethnic stratification in action.
I think the best place to start dismantling this massive topic is by separating the internal attitude from the external action.
Because they aren't the same thing, even though we talk like they are.
Right. In everyday conversation, people use the words prejudice and discrimination interchangeably all the time. But sociologically, they are fundamentally different mechanisms.
Okay, so define the difference for us.
So prejudice is the internal attitude. It's a negative, inflexible judgment or feeling about an outgroup. It exists entirely in the mind, usually built around this rigid mental image, which, we call a stereotype.
So prejudice is the software running silently in the background.
That's a great way to put it. And discrimination is the external behavioral action. It is the physical, real-world denial of equal access to societal rewards, resources, or just life chances.
It's the hardware actually executing the command to, block someone's access.
Exactly. And the distinction is critical because the internal attitude doesn't always match the external action.
Which is wild to think about. But before we get to how those two things decouple, we need to look at how that internal prejudice is constructed in the first place.
Right, the software itself.
Yeah. The sources point back to 1922 when this political journalist, Walter Lippmann, he coined the phrase, pictures in our heads, to describe stereotypes.
Oh, I love that phrase.
It's so vivid. And he made this crucial observation that we don't naturally formulate these pictures through our own empirical observations. We adopt them. They are like cultural shorthand handed down to us.
And the texts draw a very sharp, very necessary line between rational stereotypes and ethnic stereotypes.
Okay, break that down. What's a rational stereotype?
Rational stereotypes are basically benign predictive mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
They allow us to function in society without being completely paralyzed by information overload.
Like a mental shortcut.
Yeah. Like if you walk into a university lecture hall on the first day of class, you have a picture in your head of a professor. You expect the person at the front to Hand out a syllabus, deliver a lecture, grade your work.
Right, you don't have to relearn the entire concept of a teacher from scratch every single time you walk into a classroom.
Exactly. That is a survival mechanism for the brain. But ethnic stereotypes, they operate on a completely different logic. The text described them as oversimplistic, exaggerated beliefs about a group that are rigidly acquired secondhand. And the defining characteristic of an ethnic stereotype isn't just that it's a generalization, it's that it fiercely resists contradictory evidence.
Ah, so it won't update.
Right. If you meet a professor who doesn't hand out a syllabus, you just update your rational stereotype of that specific professor. You're like, oh, this guy is quirky.
Right, you don't think all professors are a lie now.
Exactly. But if someone holds an ethnic stereotype, contradictory evidence actually triggers a defense mechanism.
And the sources call that defense mechanism selective perception.
Yes, selective perception. Our brains are incredibly adept at filtering reality to protect our pre-existing beliefs.
It's like having a bouncer for your brain.
Totally. Let's say an individual holds an ethnic stereotype that a specific demographic group is lazy. As they move through the world, selective perception guarantees they will only register the existence of individuals from that group who happen to confirm that stereotype.
So a single encounter with someone who fits the bias is locked away as absolute, undeniable proof.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the brain actively filters out or just creates excuses for the vast majority of people in that same group who work grueling hours, manage multiple jobs, and completely defy the stereotype.
They just don't even see them.
The internal prejudice acts as a perceptual bouncer, only letting in data that strokes its own ego.
So the prejudice is constantly self-justifying. The natural assumption then, for most people, is that if you hold this self-justifying prejudice, you will inevitably discriminate.
Right, it feels like basic common sense.
Yeah, you hate the group, so you deny them access. If you don't hate the group, you treat them fairly. Cause and effect.
But sociologist Robert Merton proved that common sense completely wrong.
This part blew my mind.
It's fascinating. He designed this 2x2 matrix, known as Merton's paradigm, demonstrating that prejudice and discrimination actually operate independently of one another a lot of the time.
Okay, so walk us through the matrix.
He mapped out 4 distinct typologies. The first 2 are pretty straightforward. You have the all-weather liberal.
Okay.
That's someone who neither harbors prejudice nor engages in discrimination. Their internal values of equality align perfectly with their outward actions.
That makes sense.
Then you have the active bigot. This person is deeply prejudiced and actively discriminates. Think of like a Ku Klux Klan member or a neo-Nazi.
Right. They harbor the intense internal animosity and enthusiastically weaponize it in the real world.
Exactly. Those are the easy ones to spot. The next 2 typologies are where the social fabric actually starts to warp.
This is where it gets complicated.
Yeah. So the third type is the timid bigot. This person holds the internal prejudice. They have the negative picture in their head, but they do not discriminate.
Wait, but the immediate question is, why wouldn't they? If you hold the animosity, why not just act on it?
The constraint is purely environmental. The timid bigot is checked by social norms, financial pressures, or just the law.
Like they're scared of the consequences?
Exactly. Imagine a business owner who harbors intense prejudice against a particular minority group. If they operate in a society where refusing service to that group will result in a devastating lawsuit, massive public boycotts, and, the ultimate destruction of their livelihood.
They're going to smile and take the customer's money?
Yes, they will provide the service. The internal animosity remains completely intact, but the societal operating system physically blocks them from executing the discriminatory behavior.
Which brings us to the fourth typology, the fair-weather liberal. And this is the paradox that completely shatters how we normally talk about racism.
It really does.
Because the fair-weather liberal is someone who has zero prejudice. They do not hold negative stereotypes. They genuinely believe in equality, yet they actively discriminate.
They engage in the denial of resources and opportunities.
The sources provide a real-world example from 1987 that is just staggering to think about.
Oh, the pharmacy in Georgia.
Yes, a pharmacy owner in Tifton, Georgia. He hired a Black student pharmacist who was placed there for her clinical training by the University of Georgia.
Right.
The owner knew she was qualified. He had no personal animosity toward her or toward Black people in general, but shortly after she started, he fired her.
And he admitted he dismissed her purely because he feared a negative reaction from his predominantly white customer base.
He was terrified of losing his profit margin.
He sacrificed an innocent, highly qualified student's entire career trajectory which is an undeniable act of severe discrimination just to appease the bigotry of his community.
He let the external environment override his internal morals.
Exactly.
Which means you can have an entire community or like an entire corporation where very few people actually harbor deep internal hatred, but massive amounts of discrimination are still being churned out simply because people are conforming to perceived norms to protect their own standing.
The fair-weather liberal is the engine of systemic inequality.
That is such a heavy thought. But acknowledging that people conform to prejudice inevitably forces us to ask, well, where does the original prejudice come from?
Right, if we aren't born with ethnic stereotypes and we know they're culturally transmitted, how does that initial hostility take root in a population?
Psychologists point heavily to the frustration-aggression hypothesis, which is also known as the scapegoat hypothesis.
A classic psychological theory.
Yeah. The fundamental mechanism here is that when human beings are deeply frustrated in their attempts to achieve their goals, that psychological tension almost always converts into aggression.
But you can't always attack the thing frustrating you.
Right. The problem is, the actual source of our deepest frustrations is usually invisible, abstract, or vastly too powerful to confront. You can't punch a global recession.
No, you cannot.
You can't physically fight inflation or outsourcing or a shifting industrial base.
So because the genuine source of the anxiety is untouchable, the frustration is displaced onto a convenient, highly visible outgroup.
They become the punching bag.
Yes, they become an all-purpose scapegoat. They are typically a minority population that lacks the systemic power to defend themselves against the narrative. The frustrated majority projects all of their complex societal anxieties onto this single group,
Blaming them for crime, economic downturns, moral decay.
simply because the majority desperately needs a psychological release valve.
But the sources go far beyond just like situational frustration. They detail an entire psychological framework known as the architecture of the authoritarian personality.
This is fascinating stuff.
This isn't just about someone having a bad year at work and looking for someone to blame. This is a rigid cognitive structure.
Right. T.W. Adorno and his research associates developed this theory in the aftermath of World War II. They were trying to comprehend the psychological soil that allowed the Holocaust and the rise of Nazism to flourish.
Heavy research.
Very. And they concluded that extreme prejudice isn't random. It clusters within a very specific personality archetype.
The traits of this architecture are incredibly specific, too. People with an authoritarian personality are aggressively conformist. They exhibit a rigid, unyielding adherence to whatever the conventional values of their in-group happen to be.
They hate nuance.
Yes, they possess a strictly binary worldview. Nuance terrifies them. Everything is purely black and white, good or evil, right or wrong. Furthermore, they are deeply, almost pathologically submissive to powerful leaders and established authority figures within their own group.
And the texts also note their preoccupation with power, toughness, and social status, combined with a surprising tendency toward superstition.
Superstition, really?
Yeah, it's tied to that rigid thinking. Because this personality type is fundamentally wired to revere strict social hierarchies, they demand absolute obedience from anyone they perceive to be below them on the ladder.
So they punch down and kiss up.
Exactly. Consequently, they are inherently intolerant of any outgroup that occupies a subordinate position. If a minority group challenges the social order, or simply asks for equality, the authoritarian personality views it not as a request for fairness, but as a profound existential threat to the hierarchy that gives their world meaning.
And the response is aggressive suppression.
Always.
As compelling as that psychological profile is, though, this is where we really have to push back on psychology and bring in the sociologists.
Yes, sociologists have a bone to pick here.
Because if prejudice is primarily a personality defect, if it's just a symptom of a few maladjusted authoritarian individuals lashing out, how do we explain the massive synchronized shifts in prejudice that occur across entire populations almost overnight?
You can't.
Right. The sources highlight a stunning historical pivot. During World War II, the American public overwhelmingly held fiercely negative stereotypes of the Japanese and Germans,
Naturally, we were at war.
viewing them as inherently evil, hostile, and cruel. At the exact same time, the Russians were our vital allies, so the public perception of them was generally positive and sympathetic.
The geopolitical landscape was dictating the psychological landscape.
Completely. Fast forward just a few years to the late 1940s and the dawn of the Cold War. the entire paradigm flips.
Instantly.
The Japanese and Germans are suddenly reconstructed in the American consciousness as clean, efficient, industrious allies in the new global order. Meanwhile, the Russians are instantly transformed into the ultimate, sinister, existential enemy.
And you cannot logically argue that millions of Americans suddenly lost an authoritarian personality defect regarding Germany and simultaneously developed one regarding Russia, all within a 5-year window.
It makes no sense. Personality types don't change that fast across millions of people.
The rapid fluidity of those stereotypes proves that prejudice cannot be reduced to individual psychological glitches. This is the cornerstone of the sociological explanation.
Which is what?
Sociologists argue that prejudice is a learned normative response. It is a socialized behavior. We learn whom to fear, whom to revere, and whom to marginalize the exact same way we learn language, table manners, or, fashion trends.
We just absorb it.
We absorb it directly from our culture, our media, and our families.
The text leans heavily into the concept of reference groups to explain this transmission. We adopt the beliefs of the groups we desperately want to belong to or the groups we currently rely on for our identity.
Right.
There is a fascinating study cited from the 1950s by sociologist Leonard Perlin. He studied students attending Southern women's colleges during an era of intense, overt segregation.
This study is so telling.
He wanted to see if exposure to higher education and more progressive ideas would automatically reduce their prejudices against Black Americans.
And the findings completely disrupt the idea that education alone cures bigotry. Perlin discovered that simply giving these young women new, positive information about minority groups did absolutely nothing to change their internal attitudes.
The facts just bounced right off of them.
The only variable that caused a shift in their prejudice was a shift in their social allegiance.
Oh, wow.
Perlin found that their attitudes only became less prejudiced if the students began to strongly identify with new, liberal groups on campus. If they integrated into a new social circle that valued tolerance, they adopted tolerance to fit in.
So they just conformed to the new group.
Yes. But if a student kept their strongest emotional and social ties to their pre-college prejudiced reference groups back home, their family, their old friends, their prejudices remained entirely intact for all 4 years of college, regardless of what they were taught in the classroom.
The need for social belonging entirely dictated their internal beliefs.
Exactly. Sociologists recognized early on that prejudice is essentially a measure of how much distance a society demands between different groups.
Social distance.
Right. In 1925, Emery Bogardus created the Bogardus Social Distance Scale. It's a tool designed to measure the acceptable level of intimacy the dominant group is willing to grant to various ethnic or social outgroups.
It basically measures the social hierarchy by asking respondents a series of escalating questions, right?
Yes.
It starts with the most intimate level of acceptance. Would you willingly accept members of this group as close kin by marriage? Then it steps back. Would you accept them as your personal friends, as your neighbors, as co-workers in your occupation,
It keeps going.
as citizens of your country, as temporary visitors to your country, all the way down to the ultimate expression of prejudice? Would you completely exclude them from entering your country?
And by surveying a population with this scale, you can literally map the exact social distance required by the normative culture at any given moment.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
But to see how these abstract concepts, normative environments, social distance, and scapegoating actually collide in the real world, we have to examine the incredibly complex case study provided in our sources regarding Dearborn, Michigan.
Yeah, Dearborn is a perfect microcosm for observing how the social fabric weaves groups together and how external shocks can violently tear them apart.
The history detailed in the sources is essential to understanding the modern tension there. We have an interview from a Detroit news channel with Dr. Carl Karu, a third-generation Lebanese American. His family's story is like the quintessential American integration narrative.
It really is.
His grandfather arrived in the United States from Lebanon in April 1912, the exact same week the Titanic sank.
Which is just a wild historical detail.
Right. This first wave of Arab immigrants consisted primarily of single men, mostly Christian, fleeing the collapsing Ottoman Empire and seeking industrial labor.
Dr. Caro's grandfather initially settled in Danbury, Connecticut, working in a hat factory for 12 cents an hour.
Well, since.
Yeah, but the American economy was shifting from textiles to automobiles. In 1915, Henry Ford announced his revolutionary wage of $5 a day at his plant in Highland Park, Michigan.
That was huge money back then.
Massive. That economic magnet drew Dr. Caro's grandfather, along with thousands of others, to the Detroit area.
Highland Park became this vibrant, working-class melting pot. Dr. Karu's grandfather actually became the first Muslim imam in the United States, and in 1921, he helped open the nation's first mosque just blocks away from the Ford assembly line.
That is so cool.
When Ford eventually moved his primary operations to the massive Rouge plant in Dearborn, the immigrant community just followed the jobs.
And for decades, this community experienced a steady, largely peaceful process of assimilation. Dr. Karu's own family illustrates this beautifully. You have a Muslim imam grandfather, a Lebanese Christian mother, and eventually a Jewish in-law joining the family tree.
It's the American dream, practically.
The community expanded through a second wave of immigrants from Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, and then a third wave in the 1980s driven by severe conflicts in Lebanon and Iraq, which brought a higher concentration of Muslim immigrants.
By all sociological metrics, the social distance between Arab Americans and the broader Detroit community was relatively narrow. They were business owners, auto workers, doctors, civic leaders.
They were just Americans.
But then, September 11th, 2001 happened, and the normative environment did not just shift, it shattered.
Dr. Nabil Abraham, a contributor to the book Arab Detroit 9/11, describes the immediate aftermath as a sudden, suffocating demand for performative patriotism.
Performative patriotism.
Yes. The broader American society, traumatized and frightened, instantly widened the social distance. Arab Americans suddenly found themselves viewed as a suspect class. They were forced to constantly, exhaustingly prove their loyalty to a country many of their families had lived in for a century.
The sources detail how they had to walk this impossible tightrope. It wasn't enough to just go to work and pay taxes. They felt a profound societal pressure to plaster American flags on their cars, their homes, their businesses.
Just to signal they were safe.
Even their charitable giving was scrutinized. Donations that traditionally went to overseas humanitarian causes were suddenly viewed with extreme suspicion by authorities. To adapt to this hostile normative environment, the community redirected those funds locally, which ironically led to a massive boom in the construction of local mosques and cultural centers in Dearborn, such as the Arab American National Museum.
Which is a textbook example of a minority group altering its behavior to navigate the sudden prejudices of the dominant group.
Trying to survive the shift.
But to truly grasp the extremes of hostility that this environment can generate, we must analyze those raw YouTube transcripts from the sources. These transcripts are unfiltered windows into intergroup conflict.
And again, keeping in mind our disclaimer, we are just looking at these as sociological artifacts. The first transcript takes place at the Dearborn Arab Festival. For years, this was a massive, joyous street fair. It was a place for food, music, community. But the transcript drops us into a scene of chaotic confrontation. Outside protesters have descended on the festival with deliberately inflammatory signs, including one massive banner that explicitly reads, "Islam is a religion of blood and murder."
The local attendees are visibly bewildered by the provocation.
They just don't understand why this is happening.
The protesters are intentionally violating the established social distance norms of the community. They aren't there to debate. They are there to provoke a reaction that will validate their pre-existing stereotypes.
You hear the frustration from a local resident who identifies himself on camera as an atheist. He's trying to explain the community's outrage to the interviewer. He points out that for years, this festival was just a normal weekend where families from every background came to eat and have fun.
And now?
Now, because of these targeted protests, the city had to deploy a SWAT team to a family street fair. He uses this brilliant, empathetic analogy to try and break through to the interviewer, whom he assumes is Christian. He asks, "How would you feel if you were having a community picnic and a group showed up with giant signs calling Jesus a pedophile?"
Wow. He is highlighting the sheer aggression of the intrusion.
Yeah.
In the background of this exchange, the transcript notes an organization called the Michigan Peace Team, who are present to monitor the situation and promote nonviolence. Yet the videographer aggressively interrogates them, demanding that the peace team formally condemn the festival attendees based on the videographer's own hostile assumptions.
The entire scene is a manufactured friction point.
But the second transcript from the YouTube channel Free Sky Painter 1 is where the frustration, aggression, and scapegoat theories are perfectly, almost clinically demonstrated.
This one is intense.
The video is essentially a monologue by a man driving through Dearborn, and it is a masterclass in the weaponization of economic anxiety.
The creator explicitly frames his grievance around a loss of local control. He complains that driving down the street no longer feels like America to him because the strip malls, which he claims used to be owned by familiar demographics, have been replaced by businesses with an Arabic tone.
He is experiencing the friction of demographic and economic change, and his immediate response is to frame it as an invasion where the previous owners were unfairly forced out.
Having established his baseline frustration, he immediately deploys incredibly specific, weaponized ethnic stereotypes regarding wealth and welfare.
Which is classic scapegoating.
He claims he sees young Arab women stepping out of $70,000 Range Rovers and paying for their groceries with EBT welfare cards. He states that in his line of work in the medical equipment business, he sees people from the community walk in wearing designer clothes and carrying Prada purses, only to pull out Medicaid cards to pay for their items.
Notice the specific nature of the stereotype there. He is claiming they are both a massive drain on public resources and simultaneously flaunting illegitimate, exorbitant wealth.
It makes no sense.
This is an inherently contradictory stereotype, but logical consistency isn't the goal. The goal of the scapegoat narrative is to maximize resentment.
Just throw everything at the wall.
By painting them as both parasitic and elite, he justifies his own anger regarding his economic standing. He even throws out a pseudo-statistic claiming 45% of the Muslim community in the area earns less than $30,000 a year, juxtaposing it against his claims of their massive wealth to suggest widespread systemic fraud against the American taxpayer.
He then expands the perceived threat beyond local welfare fraud to global anxieties. He references 7 million Syrian refugees applying to come to the United States and explicitly asks his audience to imagine the strain on the welfare system today.
He's escalating the anxiety.
But the rhetoric quickly darkens from economic grievance to myths of inherent violence. He repeats a completely unsubstantiated claim that a police officer told a friend in jail that honor killings happen regularly in Dearborn, that young girls are murdered for having boyfriends, and the local police department actively covers it up.
That specific myth serves a vital function in the architecture of prejudice. By portraying the outgroup as fundamentally savage and fundamentally incompatible with American law and morality, he is arguing that they require maximum social distance. He is building the psychological justification for exclusion.
He doesn't stop there. He reads a supposedly anonymous email claiming that on the morning of September 11th, Muslims in Dearborn were dancing in the streets, burning American flags, and setting fire to Barbie dolls to simulate victims jumping from the Twin Towers.
Which is completely false.
It is a widely debunked urban legend that surfaced in numerous communities after 9/11, but he presents it as absolute fact. He claims the local police aren't even allowed to enter the city limits unless specifically called by Muslim leaders, describing it as a lawless Muslim West.
It's pure fear-mongering.
Right. He caps off the video by citing a single horrific news story about a 21-year-old local man who expressed a desire to commit acts of violence and attack a church. He uses the radicalization of one isolated individual to paint a community of tens of thousands of peaceful citizens as a monolithic existential threat to the nation.
Sociologically, this video is a perfect artifact of scapegoating. The creator is overwhelmed by complex, macro-level changes in the economy, immigration, and global politics. Those forces are too abstract to fight.
So he synthesizes all of his fear, frustration, and perceived loss of status into a single, terrifying picture in his head of the Muslim community.
Exactly.
Everything we've discussed so far, the authoritarian personality, the shifting stereotypes, the guy making the YouTube video, falls under what sociologists classify as microdiscrimination.
Right, microdiscrimination.
These are overt individual actions. A person writes a hateful email. A group protests a festival. It is conscious, it is loud, and it is meant to inflict harm on a specific outgroup. But as destructive as microdiscrimination is, it is just the weather. We need to elevate our view and look at the climate.
We need to look at macro or institutional discrimination.
Yes.
Macro discrimination is fundamentally different. It refers to the broad, enduring social processes that protect the advantages of the dominant group, while actively maintaining the unequal subordinate position of minority groups.
It's systemic.
Crucially, this form of discrimination doesn't rely on individual bigots acting out. It is firmly incorporated into the society's normative system. Historically, it was fully legal and customary.
The sources provide undeniable historical examples. Think of the Jim Crow laws in the American South following Reconstruction. This was a vast, legally enforced system of separate and unequal schools, housing, and public facilities designed to completely subjugate Black Americans.
It was the law.
Or look at the literacy tests used in places like Mississippi. These weren't actual tests of reading comprehension. They were deliberately weaponized legal loopholes. Black citizens attempting to register to vote would be forced to interpret obscure, highly complex portions of the state constitution to the subjective satisfaction of a white registrar.
It was impossible to pass.
The explicit goal was disenfranchisement, sanctioned by the state. And globally, you had the formal, entrenched system of apartheid in South Africa, where racial segregation and economic exploitation were the literal laws of the land.
In those historical examples, the macro discrimination was blatant, legally codified, and the intention to oppress was proudly stated by the architects of the laws.
But over the last several decades, modern societies have largely outlawed those explicit forms of institutional discrimination. You can no longer pass a law that explicitly denies a job or a home to someone based on race.
Right, but centuries of those explicit laws created a vastly unequal foundation. And upon that unequal foundation, a new, far more insidious architecture was built: structural discrimination.
This is the core revelation of the deep dive. Structural discrimination is terrifying because, as the texts emphasize, it is largely unintentional and largely unconscious.
It does not require malicious intent.
It is simply the product of the normal functioning of societal institutions. It is the track we are all running on.
Let's break down the specific mechanisms detailed in the sources, starting with the intersection of geography and employment.
Okay.
Over the latter half of the 20th century, a massive percentage of new, well-paying jobs in the United States were created in outlying suburban areas. Corporations built their sprawling office parks and shopping centers out in the suburbs because the real estate was cheaper, the highway infrastructure was newer, and the corporate tax rates were significantly lower.
From a purely capitalist perspective, moving to the suburbs makes perfect business sense. It's a rational economic decision.
It is. But we have to look at the structural foundation they were building upon. Due to decades of past, overt housing discrimination, specifically practices like redlining African Americans and other minority groups, were overwhelmingly concentrated in central inner-city areas.
Right.
Redlining was a literal government-backed practice where banks would draw red lines on maps around minority neighborhoods, declaring them hazardous for investment, and categorically refused to issue mortgages there.
Which trapped generations of families in the inner city. They were unable to build wealth through home ownership or move to the expanding suburbs.
So when the jobs moved to the suburbs decades later, the minority populations in the inner cities were geographically isolated from the new economic boom. They lived far away from the new corporate campuses and often lacked access to the reliable public transportation necessary to commute out to the suburbs every day.
The executives who chose to build their headquarters in the suburbs, they didn't sit in a boardroom and say, let's build out here so we don't have to hire black people. They didn't intend to discriminate at all. They just wanted to save on property tax.
Exactly.
Yet, the structural byproduct of their seemingly neutral business decision was massive racial discrimination in employment access.
The overt intentional discrimination in one institution housing created a devastating indirect discriminatory effect in another institution employment. The discrimination simply transferred from a malicious intent to a structural reality. The source material applies this exact same structural lens to the education system.
This one is so clear. Our public schools are largely funded by local property taxes. Because of that history of redlining and housing segregation we just talked about, minority students disproportionately attend inner-city schools situated in areas with vastly depressed property values.
Less property tax means less funding.
These schools suffer from larger class sizes, outdated textbooks, crumbling infrastructure, and fewer advanced placement courses. Consequently, the students are structurally less prepared to meet the rigid, highly competitive academic requirements of elite colleges or top-tier corporate employers.
Now, put yourself in the shoes of a college admissions officer or a corporate hiring manager. They receive an application from a student at one of those underfunded schools. The applicant has lower standardized test scores and fewer extracurriculars than a student from a wealthy, well-funded suburban school.
And the admissions officer rejects the inner-city applicant.
Yes, but the officer's not looking at race. They are looking purely at what they consider objective standards of merit.
But the objective standards are built on a structurally rigged foundation. The admissions officer can look in the mirror and truthfully say, I didn't discriminate, I just admitted the most qualified person. They are a fair-weather liberal. But the structure of society ensured that the minority applicant never had a fighting chance to become the most qualified person.
The discrimination is baked into the algorithm.
But what about when people use statistics to justify treating groups differently, like a bank looking at credit scores?
How this insidious nature of structural discrimination becomes even more complex when institutions actively use statistics. This brings us to a highly controversial concept called statistical discrimination.
Yeah, okay, what is that?
This occurs when individuals or institutions treat people negatively based on statistical beliefs about the broader category they belong to. It is presented not as malice, but as a rational shortcut in situations where perfect information is too costly or difficult to obtain.
The classic example is banking and lending, right?
Yes. Let's say a bank is evaluating loan applications in a specific minority neighborhood. Historically, the loan default rates in that area have been higher, which, as we just discussed, is often the direct result of redlining and structural economic isolation. A loan officer, whose only mandate is to minimize risk and maximize profit for the bank, looks the zip code. Instead of spending the time and money to deeply investigate the individual financial responsibility of the specific applicant sitting in front of them, the officer relies on the aggregate statistics of the neighborhood.
They mitigate their perceived risk by either denying the loan entirely or offering it at a significantly higher interest rate.
The loan officer is stereotyping the individual based on the statistical average of the group. From the bank's cold economic perspective, investigating every single applicant's individual nuance is inefficient. Relying on the statistical shortcut of geography, which is inevitably tied to race, is cheaper.
The discriminator absolves themselves of bigotry by claiming they're simply making a sound business decision.
The text points out that racial profiling by police operates on the exact same logic. If historical arrest statistics show a higher crime rate in a certain demographic, often due to decades of over-policing and economic disenfranchisement, a police department might decide to disproportionately deploy officers to those neighborhoods and disproportionately stop and investigate individuals from that demographic.
Because they view it as an efficient deployment of limited resources based on data.
But statistical discrimination creates a devastating, inescapable, self-fulfilling prophecy. If a bank denies loans to a neighborhood based on statistical risk, businesses cannot open, homes cannot be repaired, and the neighborhood economically collapses, thereby proving the bank's initial assumption that it was a bad risk.
Wow.
And if a police department disproportionately targets and patrols a specific minority group, they will invariably arrest more people from that group for minor offenses that might go unnoticed in a wealthy suburb. This artificially inflates the crime statistics for that demographic, which the department then uses to justify even more aggressive profiling the following year.
It is a closed-loop system of institutionalized oppression that hides behind a mask of mathematical objectivity.
Exactly.
If these structural systems are so obviously damaging, and if we can clearly see the feedback loops of inequality they create, why do they persist? Why don't we just rewrite the tax codes, fix the school funding models, and dismantle the structural barriers?
To answer that, we have to look at power conflict theories. These theories assert a very uncomfortable truth. Discrimination persists structurally because it profoundly benefits the dominant group. The inequality is a feature, not a bug.
Always follow the money.
Exactly. The text touches on classical Marxist theory, which argues that the capitalist elite actively foster ethnic division and racism to keep the working class fragmented. As long as white laborers and minority laborers view each other as the primary enemy, fighting over racial grievances, they will never unite across racial lines to demand better wages, better health care, or better working conditions from the corporate elite.
Racism is the ultimate union buster.
There is also the split labor market theory. This theory posits that the primary drivers of prejudice aren't necessarily the wealthy elite at the very top, but rather the higher-paid dominant group workers in the middle.
Oh, interesting.
These workers use prejudice, segregation, and exclusionary union practices to keep cheaper minority labor completely out of their specific job sectors. By restricting the labor supply, they protect their own artificially high wages and job security.
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of today's deep dive, and the perfect illustration of how the dominant group actively fights to protect its structural advantages. Dr. Edward Opokudapa's 2007 sociological study of Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
This study is a microscopic, undeniable look at modern prejudice.
Let's set the historical and demographic scene. In 2007, Winston-Salem is a city of roughly 186,000 people. The population is about 56% white and 40% African American. It is a city built on the immense wealth of the tobacco and textile manufacturing industries, most notably R.J. Reynolds Tobacco.
But that wealth was historically entirely bifurcated by race. For generations, most African Americans in Winston-Salem began their economic lives as low-wage laborers on white-owned tobacco farms or performing menial labor in the factories.
And while the civil rights movement dismantled the overt legal segregation, the deep structural economic disparities remain deeply entrenched in the city's architecture.
Dr. Opoku-Dapa lays out the statistics, and they are stark. In 2007, African Americans in the city were more than twice as likely to be unemployed, 12%, compared to just 5% for white residents. The median family income for African Americans was less than two-thirds that of white families.
And this maldistribution of resources was glaringly obvious when looking at the public school system.
The researcher physically observed what amounted to a two-tiered educational system operating within the same city limits. On one hand, you had schools like Jefferson High, located in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods. These schools were heavily supplemented by the deep pockets of local PTAs. They had state-of-the-art resources, abundant computers, extensive test preparation materials.
And on the other hand,
You had elementary schools like Kimberly Park and Cook Elementary, located in historically segregated, predominantly African-American neighborhoods.
and those schools were literally starving for resources. They lacked basic instructional materials. Because the local property values were depressed and the parents didn't have the disposable income to write massive checks to the PTA, the structural deficit was impossible to overcome.
The disparity extended aggressively into the criminal justice system as well. The 2001 arrest records from the Winston-Salem Police Department highlight an immense structural double standard.
Give us the numbers.
For drug offenses, there were 2,215 arrests of African Americans, compared to only 757 white residents. Yet when you look at DUI offenses, a crime statistically more prevalent among wealthier demographics with access to vehicles and alcohol in social settings, the numbers flipped.
Right.
There were 678 white residents arrested for DUIs versus 503 African Americans. The enforcement of the law was clearly disproportionately targeting the minority population.
Against this backdrop of obvious, undeniable structural inequality, Dr. Opoku-Dapa sent white researchers into the field to conduct in-depth, face-to-face interviews with 77 white residents of Winston-Salem. The goal was to gauge their genuine opinions about African Americans and the state of race relations in the city.
Based on their responses, the study categorized the white residents into three distinct typologies. And the breakdown of these typologies reveals exactly how structural racism sustains itself today.
Okay, what was Category 1?
Category 1 was the racial equalitarian. This was a small minority of the respondents, only 15 out of the 77.
These individuals were generally highly educated, with over half possessing post-secondary degrees. They lived in reality. They clearly recognized the stark disparities in the city.
Yes, they acknowledged that white residents held unearned privileges relative to African Americans. They were deeply dissatisfied with the unequal conditions in schools like Kimberly Park, and they recognized that the criminal justice system was structurally biased.
Because they saw the track was rigged, they supported systemic remedies like affirmative action and actively welcomed residential integration.
Category 2 was the prejudiced. This was also a minority, comprising 21 out of the 77 respondents. The demographic profile here skewed toward middle-aged individuals with significantly less formal education.
This group clung to strict negative cultural stereotypes. They fundamentally believed that African Americans brought discrimination upon themselves by allegedly deviating from mainstream cultural expectations regarding work ethic and family structure.
They engaged in a complete, almost hallucinatory denial of structural reality. One respondent literally told the interviewer, "There is no discrimination anywhere in Winston against any child who wants to go to school or anybody who wants to earn a living."
Which is an astounding statement when the data clearly shows schools miles apart operating in different centuries regarding resources.
This group also vastly, wildly overestimated African American reliance on public assistance. When the researchers asked if African Americans received better treatment regarding government programs, they enthusiastically agreed. They complained bitterly about minority groups getting free housing and financial aid.
They completely ignored the statistical reality that white Americans are just as likely to depend on welfare programs.
Yes. Furthermore, they were entirely blind to the massive, invisible welfare programs that overwhelmingly benefit the white middle and upper class, like the mortgage interest tax deduction, which subsidizes homeownership to the tune of billions of dollars.
This group's worldview was fueled by deep ethnocentrism and a psychological need to blame the outgroup for any societal friction. But it's Category 3 that represents the true, hidden bedrock of structural discrimination.
Category 3 is the ambivalent. And crucially, they were the vast majority of the respondents, 41 out of 77.
The demographic profile of the ambivalent group is what makes them so fascinating. They were young, mostly between the ages of 22 and 35. They were fairly well educated. And unlike the prejudiced group, the ambivalent group actually acknowledged reality.
They saw the unequal schools. They recognized that the social and economic game in Winston-Salem was not played on a level field.
They did not hold the overt, venomous cultural stereotypes of the older, prejudiced group. They even claimed to support residential integration and equal rights.
However, this is where the paradox locks into place. Despite openly acknowledging that the system was fundamentally unequal and that minority groups were structurally disadvantaged, the ambivalent group strongly and actively opposed any systemic remedies designed to fix it. They vehemently opposed affirmative action or targeted funding, insisting instead that society must rely on purely open competition for jobs and university enrollment.
This is the crux of the entire deep dive. Why would a young, educated person look at a 100-meter dash, admit that one runner is forced to start 20 meters back with hurdles in their lane, but then passionately demand that the race proceed without changing the rules, claiming that moving the starting blocks would be unfair?
Sociologists define this exact phenomenon as colorblind racism. By insisting on purely open competition in a society that is already deeply structurally unequal, the ambivalent group is subtly, perhaps even unconsciously, protecting their own unearned social and economic privileges.
They're using the language of fairness to defend a rigged game that guarantees their victory.
And we have to look at the economic context of Winston-Salem at the time. The job market was tightening. The major historical employer, R.J. Reynolds, was restructuring and cutting thousands of jobs.
When economic opportunities shrink, the dominant group feels the friction.
Right. The ambivalent respondents, who were young and entering this tightening workforce, perceived policies meant to redress inequality like affirmative action, not as a push for justice, but as a direct personal threat to their own status and their own ability to secure a job.
So they advocate for colorblind policies. They say, let the best person win based purely on merit.
They advocate for this knowing full well that the structural advantages of being white, having attended better-funded schools, having access to better health care, and possessing inherited wealth will ensure they continue to win the vast majority of the time.
They want the government to stay out of it because the status quo already serves them perfectly. And the absolute brilliance of this deep dive is how it connects this 2007 sociological study to our final source. A recent Yahoo Finance article analyzing the modern workplace phenomenon of the Nepo baby.
The connection exposes the ultimate hypocrisy of the ambivalent demand for open competition.
Because when the ambivalent group in Winston-Salem complains that affirmative action is an unfair quota system that gives unearned advantages to minorities, they are willfully, intentionally ignoring the massive, invisible affirmative action program that has existed exclusively for the dominant group for centuries: nepotism and entrenched social capital.
The data presented in the Yahoo Finance article is staggering, and it completely demolishes the myth of a pure meritocracy in the American workplace.
Lay it out for us.
According to data from Harvard University's Opportunity Insights Project, nearly 1/3 of Americans will work at the exact same firm as one of their parents before they reach the age of 30.
1/3 of the workforce is getting a job where their parent already holds influence.
And the advantage isn't just getting a foot in the door. The data explicitly shows that individuals working at their parents' firm earn nearly 20% more than they would if they acquired a job elsewhere based purely on their own resume.
And who benefits from this nepotism the most?
The demographic breakdown is undeniable. The data shows it overwhelmingly benefits white men from high-income households. The nepotism premium for low-income individuals, women, or minority applicants is statistically negligible by comparison.
The article quotes a financial influencer, Vivian Tu, who perfectly captures the frustration of this reality. She points out that a minority applicant can do everything society asks of them. They can work their tail off, take on crushing student debt, grind from the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder, and still get passed up for a life-changing promotion simply because the senior vice president's great-nephew needed a soft landing after finishing a liberal arts degree.
That is not open competition.
That is a rigged aristocracy based on bloodlines, legacy admissions, and country club connections.
It is the ultimate manifestation of social capital. And the structural advantage extends beyond literal family, ties into the old boys club mentality that pervades corporate culture. The article highlights a 2019 study demonstrating that men advanced further in their careers and saw a 13% pay increase simply by being assigned to male managers.
Why?
Because they were structurally more likely to share informal work breaks, go golfing, and schmooze with their male bosses, gaining an inside track to promotions and mentorship that women and minorities in the exact same positions were entirely locked out of.
So when a young, white, ambivalent respondent in Winston-Salem says, "I just want everyone to be judged on their individual merits without any special help from the government," they are completely blind to the fact that their uncle getting them a summer internship at the brokerage firm or their dad's golfing buddy putting their resume at the top of the pile is special help.
Exactly. They have internalized their own structural advantages as personal merit, while simultaneously viewing any systemic attempt to level the playing field for marginalized groups as a violation of fairness.
And that, ultimately, is how structural discrimination is flawlessly maintained without a single racial slur ever being uttered. The architecture of inequality does not require active bigots burning crosses to function. It merely requires the vast majority of people who benefit from the inequality to passionately defend the status quo under the guise of neutrality and colorblind fairness.
We have journeyed through an immense amount of sociological terrain today.
We really have. We started by analyzing prejudice as a cognitive mechanism, the pictures in our heads that rely on selective perception to filter out reality.
We explored the deep psychological glitches of the authoritarian personality, where individuals terrified of a changing world lash out in frustration, utilizing marginalized groups as an all-purpose scapegoat.
We saw that raw, unfiltered hostility play out in real time in the Dearborn YouTube transcripts, where complex economic anxieties were violently projected onto a single community through fabricated myths and weaponized stereotypes.
But as we elevated our view from micro to macro, we discovered the truly terrifying reality.
That structural framework.
Right. The most enduring architecture of discrimination isn't built by the loud, angry individuals protesting at festivals. It is built silently into the zoning laws that push minority populations away from suburban job centers.
It is built into the property tax formulas that intentionally starve inner-city schools of basic resources.
It is built into the statistical algorithms of the banking system and the criminal justice system, which quietly and efficiently replicate historical inequalities while claiming absolute mathematical objectivity.
And we learned from the Winston-Salem study that simply recognizing the problem exists is completely insufficient to solve it. When the dominant group feels their economic security is threatened, they will weaponize colorblind rhetoric to protect a system they know is unequal, stubbornly ignoring the massive, invisible benefits they reap from nepotism and entrenched social capital.
Recognizing these hidden psychological and systemic architectures really is the crucial first step, because if you don't realize the track is rigged, you will spend your entire life wondering why some people never seem to run fast enough.
The system relies on our failure to see the structures holding it together. Which leaves us with a profound question regarding our own participation in this system. The structures of society, the schools, the banks, the hiring pipelines are meticulously designed to maintain themselves without our active, conscious input. They run on autopilot. They are simply the normal functioning of our institutions.
Right.
If structural discrimination is maintained simply by everyday people going along with the normal functioning of society, then isn't neutrality just another word for complicity? What happens when we finally realize that simply being not racist in our own internal attitudes isn't nearly enough to stop the massive grinding machinery of a discriminatory system? We want to thank you so deeply for joining us on this complex, challenging journey into the social fabric unraveled. Keep questioning the architecture around you.